3 months after the truth came out, I found a notification on my phone. A podcast episode, uploaded without fanfare. The description read, "For Grandma, whose voice still carries." I listened in the dark, her words, fractured but fierce, woven into stories I'd forgotten she told. My niece hadn't just saved them. She'd given them wings. I keep the app pinned now, a reminder not of what we lost, but what we almost let slip. The kitchen clock carved time into sharp, insistent ticks, slicing through the morning's haze. A mug of coffee sat cooling on the counter, steam curling upward like a ghost abandoning its post. Mark stood over the sink, staring at a spreadsheet on his laptop, numbers blurring into static. His fingers hovered over the keys, caught between a half-finished email and the weight of the day already pressing down. From the living room, a faint murmur drifted, his mother's voice, soft and fractured, like a melody played on a broken string. She was awake, stirring in her recliner, her words unintelligible but heavy with intent. He didn't move to check. Not yet. Mornings were for holding the line, keeping the chaos at bay. Mark was 47, the son who stayed when others drifted. 5 years ago, his mother's dementia had slipped into their lives, quiet at first, a misplaced name here, a forgotten face there. Then it grew teeth, gnawing away at her clarity until she was a shadow of the woman who'd once balanced budgets and baked pies with surgical precision. Now, she was a puzzle with missing pieces, and Mark was left to guard what remained. His sister, Claire, lived 3 states away, her contributions limited to sporadic checks and emails that always ended with "I'll call soon." The rest fell to him, medication sorted into plastic grids, meals reheated from Tupperware, appointments juggled between deadlines. Work was a relentless hum, a sales job that demanded crisp reports and endless calls, each one a reminder of how far behind he'd fallen. Guilt stacked higher than the unwashed dishes, a monument to the corners he cut to keep it all from collapsing. The house itself seemed to lean under the strain. Once a place of warmth, its walls now held the faint musk of neglect. Dust in the corners, a faucet that dripped no matter how tightly he turned it. The living room was Mom's domain, her recliner a throne of faded upholstery, flanked by a side table cluttered with pill bottles and a radio that hadn't worked in years. She spent her days there, eyes sometimes sharp, sometimes vacant, her hands fidgeting with the hem of a blanket. Mark had learned to read her moods through those hands. Restless meant discomfort, still meant peace. Today they twisted, knotting the fabric into tight coils. He noticed, but didn't linger. There was a client meeting at 10, and the inbox blinked with unread messages, each one a small accusation. This summer, a new presence had settled into the house. Lily, Claire's daughter, 19 and fresh from her first year of college, arrived with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a phone that seemed an extension of her hand. She was staying to help, though Mark suspected it was less about charity and more about dodging whatever drama brewed at home. Claire had mentioned a new boyfriend, a detail Lily neither confirmed nor denied. She moved through the house like a shadow, her footsteps soft, her presence unobtrusive. Her dark hair was always pulled back, her eyes quick but guarded, as if she were measuring the space before claiming it. Mark didn't mind her quiet. Silence was a currency he understood, a way to keep the fragile balance intact. Mom's murmurs grew sharper as the morning wore on, her voice threading through the clock's rhythm. She was reaching for something, a thought, a memory, her hands clutching the blanket like it might anchor her. Mark closed his laptop, the spreadsheet unfinished, and crossed into the living room. She sat upright, her gaze fixed on the window where sunlight spilled across the carpet. Her face, lined and softened by time, held a flicker of urgency. She was trying to say something, her lips shaping words that didn't quite form. He knelt beside her, adjusting the blanket, his hands brushing hers. They were cold, trembling. He told himself it was just the disease, another trick of her unraveling mind, but the intensity in her eyes tugged at him, a hook catching on something deeper. The homemaid, Brenda, arrived at 9, her menthol scent cutting through the room before she did. She moved with practiced ease, her purse slung over one arm, her smile broad but fleeting. She was a lifeline, reliable, affordable, the kind of help Mark couldn't afford to lose. She checked Mom's vitals, rearranged pillows, her movements efficient but impersonal. Mark nodded his thanks, already turning back to his laptop. Brenda's presence meant he could steal an hour for work, maybe 2 if Mom stayed calm. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have time. Lily was there when Brenda arrived, perched on the couch with her phone, her thumb scrolling absently. She'd taken to sitting near Mom, her silence less about avoidance and more about observation. She'd started recording things, Mom's stories, she said, for a school project. Mark didn't understand it. Mom's tales were fragments now, half-remembered anecdotes about her childhood or recipes she'd never cook again. But Lily listened, her phone angled like a witness, capturing what Mark had stopped hearing. He caught her watching Brenda once, her eyes narrowing slightly, a pause that felt deliberate. It unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way she seemed to see things he didn't, like she was tracing lines he'd long since erased. Mom's hands were moving again, faster now, plucking at the air. She was reaching for something, a ring, she'd said yesterday, her mother's ring, a gold band with a single pearl. She'd mentioned it before, her voice insistent, then fading into murmurs. Mark had checked her jewelry box weeks ago, finding only tangled chains and a few plastic beads. He'd assumed she'd misplaced it, or worse, that it was another ghost her mind had conjured. Dementia did that, turned memories into thieves, stealing what was already gone. He promised to look again, but the promise felt hollow, drowned out by the hum of his phone vibrating with a work alert. Lily shifted on the couch, her phone still out, its lens catching the light. She was recording again, her focus on Mom's hands, the way they twisted, searching. Mark felt a prickle of irritation. What was she chasing? Mom's words were nonsense half the time, loops of repetition that led nowhere. But Lily's attention was unwavering, her stillness a contrast to the house's restless pulse. She wasn't just listening, she was collecting, piecing together something Mark hadn't bothered to notice. The morning slipped away, swallowed by emails and Mom's restless shifting. Brenda left at noon, her menthol scent lingering like a signature. Mark moved through his routine, lunch for Mom, a sandwich he barely tasted, another call he couldn't postpone. The house settled into its familiar rhythm, but something felt off, like a note played just out of tune. Mom's hands hadn't stopped moving, her murmurs circling back to the ring, the earrings, the locket. Her eyes, when they met his, held a clarity that made his chest tighten. He pushed it down, told himself it was nothing. But Lily was still there, her phone a quiet sentinel, and for the first time, Mark wondered what she was hearing that he wasn't. The clock ticked on, indifferent, marking the hours until the weight of the day would shift again. Mark opened his laptop, the spreadsheet staring back, but his mind was elsewhere, caught on Mom's trembling hands in the shadow of Lily's gaze. He didn't know it yet, but the house was already whispering truths he'd been too tired to hear. The house exhaled at dusk, its creaks softening as sunlight bled into shadow. Mark sat at the kitchen table, laptop closed, a glass of water untouched beside him. His eyes burned from hours of staring at sales projections, but his mind was elsewhere, snagged on the morning's unease. Mom's recliner hummed faintly in the living room, its motor stuck in a low whine from years of use. She was asleep now, her hands finally still, the blanket tucked around her like a cocoon. The silence felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it. Lily moved through the house with the same quiet precision she'd brought all summer. She was at the counter now, earbuds in, her phone screen casting a pale glow across her face. Her fingers tapped rapidly, pausing only to adjust the cords dangling from her ears. Mark watched her for a moment, struck by how little he knew her. She was Claire's daughter, yes, but a stranger in his orbit, a college kid with a life he couldn't picture. Her presence was a concession, a favor to his sister, but it was starting to feel like something else. Something heavier. Mom's murmurs had lingered in his mind all day. The ring, the earrings, her insistence wasn't new, but its clarity was. Yesterday, her voice had cut through the fog, sharp enough to make him pause. He brushed it off, as always, blaming the disease for planting false alarms. But the way her eyes had locked onto his, unyielding, kept resurfacing, like a photograph he couldn't unsee. He checked her jewelry box again before work, finding nothing but dust and a broken clasp. The absence felt louder than it should have, a gap he couldn't explain. Lily's recordings were another thread he couldn't ignore. She spent hours with Mom, her phone angled to catch every word, every pause. At first, he'd thought it was nostalgia, a kid preserving scraps of family history. But there was purpose in her focus, a deliberateness that made him uneasy. She wasn't just listening. She was sifting, sorting through Mom's fragments like a prospector panning for gold. He'd seen her at night, hunched over her laptop, headphones on, her brow furrowed as if the recordings held secrets she hadn't cracked yet. It irritated him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the reminder of how little he listened himself. Brenda's arrival that morning had followed the usual rhythm. Her menthol scent swept in first, sharp and invasive, followed by her brisk efficiency. She checked Mom's pulse, adjusted her pillows, moved through the room like it was a checklist. Mark had nodded his thanks, already halfway out the door in his mind. Brenda was a constant, a gear in the machine that kept Mom alive. Questioning her felt like questioning gravity, pointless, destabilizing. But Lily's presence had shifted something. She'd been in the living room when Brenda arrived, her phone out, her eyes tracking the aide's movements with a stillness that felt like judgment. Mom woke briefly during Brenda's shift, her voice rising again. The ring, always the ring. Her hands clawed at the blanket, searching for something no one could see. Brenda had smoothed her hair, her smile tight, and Mark had turned away, the moment swallowed by a work call. But Lily hadn't moved. She'd stayed, her phone catching the exchange, its lens a silent witness. Mark had noticed her later, replaying the clip, her lips pursed as if she'd found a thread to pull. He hadn't asked. Questions took time, and time was a currency he didn't have. Now, with the house settled, the weight of the day pressed harder. Mark's shoulders ached, not from lifting Mom, she was frail now, her body light as paper, but from carrying everything else. The bills on the counter, the emails piling up, the gnawing sense that he was failing at all of it. He'd chosen this role, or it had chosen him, but either way, it was his. Claire's checks helped, but they came with distance, a reminder that she'd built a life beyond this house. Mark hadn't. He was here, tethered to Mom's decline, to the routines that kept them both afloat. Lily unplugged her earbuds, the faint hiss of audio spilling into the quiet. She glanced at Mark, her expression unreadable, then turned back to her phone. He felt the urge to speak, to ask what she was chasing, but the words stuck. Instead, he stood, crossing to the fridge, the hum of its motor filling the space where questions might have lived. He pulled out a soda, the can cold against his palm, and leaned against the counter, watching Lily's silhouette. She was annotating something now, her fingers moving with a precision that felt out of place in this house of approximations. Mom's jewelry box sat on a shelf in her room, a wooden relic from decades past. Mark had checked it again that afternoon, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name. The emptiness inside was stark, no gold band, no pearl earrings, just a velvet lining worn thin from years of handling. He closed it quickly, as if the absence might accuse him. Mom's accusations weren't new, but their persistence was. She'd always been meticulous, her treasures cataloged with a bookkeeper's care. Dementia had stolen that order, or so he thought. Now, he wasn't sure. Lily's recordings were starting to feel like a mirror, reflecting back what he'd chosen not to see. He remembered a moment from last week, Mom's voice, clear as a bell, cutting through the usual fog. She'd been talking to Lily, her words deliberate, her hands steady. Mark had been in the next room, half listening, distracted by a client's email. But the tone had stayed with him, a clarity that didn't fit the narrative he'd built. He dismissed it as he dismissed so much, because believing her meant unraveling everything else. Brenda's efficiency was another constant he'd stopped questioning. She was there when he wasn't, filling gaps he couldn't. But Lily's attention had cast a shadow over that certainty. He'd caught her watching Brenda yesterday, her phone angled just so, capturing the aide's quick movements as she tidied Mom's dresser. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly, but it was close, a quiet scrutiny that made Mark wonder what he'd missed. Brenda's smile had faltered once, her eyes flicking to Lily before settling back into place. Mark had noticed but let it pass, his mind already racing to the next task. The kitchen clock ticked on, its rhythm a metronome for the house's pulse. Mark sipped his soda, the carbonation sharp against his tongue. Lily was still at the counter, her phone dark now, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small, younger than her 19 years, but there was a weight to her stillness, a purpose Mark couldn't parse. He wanted to ask, to break the silence, but the house felt too heavy, its secrets tucked into corners he hadn't swept in years. Mom stirred in the living room, a soft cough pulling Mark back. He crossed the threshold, adjusting her blanket, her face slack in sleep. Her hands were curled now, no longer searching, but the memory of their restlessness lingered. Lily followed, her footsteps silent, her phone tucked away. She stood at the edge of the room, watching Mom, watching him. And in that moment, Mark felt it, a crack in the routine, a whisper of something he'd been too tired to hear. The house held its breath at dawn, the air thick with the promise of heat. Mark stood at the kitchen window, coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at the backyard where weeds choked the flower beds his mother once tended. The world outside was still, but inside, tension coiled like a spring. Mom's recliner creaked faintly from the living room, her sleep restless, her hands twitching even now. The weight of her accusations, ring, earrings, locket, had rooted in Mark's mind, no longer dismissible as dementia's tricks. They were seeds, sprouting questions he couldn't uproot. Lily was already awake, perched at the dining table, her laptop open, its screen casting a blue glow across her face. Her earbuds were in, her fingers scrolling through files with a focus that felt almost surgical. She'd been like this for days, her recordings no longer a side project but a mission. Mark watched her from the corner of his eye, the distance between them both comfort and unease. She was Claire's daughter, a guest in his home, yet her presence was reshaping the space, forcing him to see what he'd let fade into the background. Mom's clarity from yesterday lingered like a bruise. Her voice, sharp and certain, had cut through the usual haze, pinning him with a truth he hadn't wanted to face. The ring, her mother's, gold with a single pearl, wasn't just a memory, it was a tether, a piece of her past she clung to as the present unraveled. Mark had checked her jewelry box again last night, his fingers tracing the empty velvet, the absence heavier than ever. He'd always assumed she'd misplaced her treasures, hidden them in some forgotten corner like the spoons he'd found in her pillowcase last year. But her insistence, paired with Lily's quiet scrutiny, was eroding that certainty. Brenda arrived at her usual time, her menthol scent sweeping through the house like a warning. She moved with the same brisk efficiency, checking Mom's vitals, fluffing pillows, her hands never still. Mark nodded as she entered, his routine acknowledgement, but his gaze lingered longer than usual. He noticed the way her purse hung heavy on her shoulder, the way her smile tightened when she caught Lily watching from the couch. Brenda was a necessity, a cog in the machine that kept Mom alive, but necessity didn't mean trust. Not anymore. Lily's recordings had become a lens, sharpening Mark's view of the house's rhythms. He'd overheard her replaying a clip last night, Mom's voice clear and deliberate, naming Brenda, describing hands in her dresser. The words had hit like a stone through glass, fracturing his assumptions. He wanted to dismiss it, dementia-twisted reality, after all, but Lily's notes, meticulous and time-stamped, were harder to ignore. She logged Brenda's shifts, cross-referencing them with Mom's lucid moments, building a map of inconsistencies Mark hadn't thought to look for. Brenda had claimed to be with Mom at noon last Wednesday, but Lily's recording placed Mom alone, muttering about pockets and taking. The gap was small, but it was real. Mark's mornings were usually a blur of emails and half-eaten breakfasts, but today he moved slower, his attention split. He watched Brenda as she tidied Mom's room, her hands lingering on the dresser, rearranging trinkets with a care that felt performative. He noticed the way she glanced at Lily, a flicker of unease in her eyes, gone as quickly as it came. Mark's chest tightened, not with certainty, but with the possibility that he'd been blind. He'd relied on Brenda's competence, her affordability, letting her fill the gaps he couldn't. Now, those gaps felt like chasms. Mom woke mid-morning, her voice rising in fragments. She was searching again, her hands clawing at the blanket, her eyes darting to the dresser. Mark knelt beside her, adjusting her pillow, his touch gentle but distracted. Her gaze held him, sharp and pleading, as if she were trying to hand him a truth he wasn't ready to carry. He promised to look for the ring, the words automatic, but they felt hollow, a reflex worn thin by repetition. Lily was there, as always, her phone angled to catch Mom's movements, her silence a steady pressure. Mark felt exposed under her gaze, as if she could see the shortcuts he'd taken, the moments he'd chosen ease over vigilance. The mail arrived at noon, a stack of bills and catalogs Mark barely glanced at. Tucked among them was an envelope, forwarded by mistake, addressed to Claire. He opened it without thinking, his fingers tearing the paper before he could reconsider. A bank statement, Claire's name at the top, with a withdrawal $4,000, labeled medical expenses. The number stopped him cold. Claire had been vague about money lately, her emails brief, her call shorter. Mark's mind went to the locket, Mom's heirloom, worth thousands if sold. He didn't want to suspect his sister, but the thought took root, twisting with the weight of Mom's missing treasures. He stood frozen, the statement crumpled in his hand. Claire had always been the practical one, the one who planned and calculated. Selling the locket to cover Mom's bills, meds, therapies, gaps in insurance, fit her logic. But hiding it, leaving him to shoulder the guilt alone, didn't. The house felt smaller, its walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken betrayals. Mark shoved the statement into a drawer, his pulse loud in his ears. He needed to call Claire, to hear her explain, but the thought of her voice, laced with excuses, made his stomach churn. Lily was at the table again, her laptop open, her fingers moving with quiet purpose. She'd found something else, Mark could tell. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes narrowed at the screen. He wanted to ask, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he crossed to the living room, where Mom was stirring again, her hands reaching for ghosts. Brenda was there, humming softly, her purse on the floor, its zipper half open. Mark's gaze lingered on it, a question forming he wasn't ready to voice. The day wore on, the house's pulse unsteady. Mark moved through his tasks, lunch for Mom, a report half finished, a call he let go to voicemail. But his attention kept drifting, pulled to Lily's quiet intensity, to Mom's restless hands, to the envelope burning a hole in his mind. Brenda left at 2, her departure marked by the faint clink of her keys, a sound that now felt like a warning. Mark stood at the sink, staring at the weeds outside, his reflection faint in the glass. He'd built this life on necessity, on survival, but necessity was cracking, and the truths beneath it were starting to show. Lily closed her laptop, the sound sharp in the quiet. She looked at Mark, her eyes steady, holding something he couldn't name. And in that moment, he felt the house shift, a crack widening, a whisper growing louder, a truth he could no longer outrun. The house seemed to hum at twilight, its walls absorbing the day's heat, exhaling a restless energy. Mark stood in the kitchen, the faucet dripping despite his efforts to fix it, each plink a metronome for his thoughts. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of reheated soup and the faint trace of Brenda's menthol that lingered like an unwelcome guest. Mom's recliner was silent now, her breathing slow, her hands still under the blanket. But the truths unearthed today, Claire's betrayal, Brenda's theft, were alive, pulsing through the house like a current Mark couldn't shut off. Lily sat at the dining table, her laptop closed, her phone resting beside it like a sentinel. Her presence, once unobtrusive, now carried weight, her quiet focus a mirror to Mark's growing unease. She'd been the catalyst, her recordings peeling back layers he'd let settle into dust. He watched her from the counter, his hands gripping the edge, the wood cool against his palms. She was no longer just Claire's daughter, a temporary guest. She was a force, reshaping the house's rhythm, forcing him to confront what he'd buried under routine. The bank statement haunted him, its numbers burned into his mind. Claire's $4,000 withdrawal, labeled medical, was no coincidence. The locket, Mom's heirloom, gold with a filigree clasp, was worth enough to cover such a sum. Mark had found the statement yesterday, tucked among bills, its presence a quiet accusation. He'd wanted to believe it was a mistake, a clerical error, but Claire's silence told another story. She'd been distant for months, her emails clipped, her calls rare. Selling Mom's treasures to bridge insurance gaps fit her pragmatism, but hiding it, leaving Mark to carry the weight alone, was a wound he hadn't expected. The house, once a shared anchor, felt fractured, its foundation cracked by secrets. Brenda's betrayal was sharper, more immediate. Lily's recordings had exposed her, not through confrontation but through precision. Mark had listened to the clip last night, Brenda's voice caught mid-laugh, casual and cruel. Old lady won't miss it. The words had coiled in his chest, cold and undeniable. He'd checked her purse this morning, his heart pounding, fingers trembling as he unzipped the side pocket. Inside, Mom's pearl studs gleamed, small but damning. He'd held them in his palm, their weight heavier than gold, a proof he couldn't ignore. Brenda's efficiency, her reliability, had been a facade, a mask for petty thefts slipped into pockets while Mom's mind faltered. He'd fired her at noon, the moment unfolding in the living room's dim light. Brenda's face had tightened, her smile collapsing into a scowl, her voice rising in denial. Mark had stood firm, the studs clenched in his fist, his anger not at her, but at himself. He'd trusted her, leaned on her, let her fill gaps he was too stretched to cover. She'd left without apology, her purse slung over her shoulder, the menthol scent trailing her like a signature. The house felt lighter in her absence, but the relief was fleeting, overshadowed by the cost of replacing her. Aids were scarce, and trust, once broken, was harder to rebuild. Mark crossed to Mom's room now, the floorboards creaking under his weight. She was awake, her eyes catching the lamplight, her hands folded in her lap. He sat beside her, adjusting the blanket, his touch softer than it had been in weeks. Her gaze held him, not sharp like before, but present, as if she sensed the shift. He wanted to apologize, for dismissing her, for letting Brenda's hands roam unchecked, but the words stayed lodged, too raw to surface. Instead, he squeezed her hand, her skin cool and fragile, a silent promise to do better. Lily's recordings were more than evidence of theft. They were a bridge to Mom's fading voice. Mark had underestimated her project, dismissing it as a kid's whim. But Lily had been collecting Mom's stories, childhood memories, recipes, fragments of laughter, with a care Mark hadn't thought to offer. She'd shown him a clip yesterday, Mom's voice clear, recounting a summer at her parents' farm, her words vivid despite the disease's grip. It was a gift, not just to Mom but to him, a reminder of who she'd been before the fog settled. Lily wasn't just preserving. She was reclaiming, stitching together a legacy Mark had let unravel. He returned to the kitchen, the clock ticking softer now, its rhythm less insistent. Lily was still at the table, her phone dark, her hands folded. She looked up, her eyes steady, holding a quiet strength that made Mark pause. He wanted to thank her, to acknowledge the crack she'd opened, but gratitude felt too small. Instead, he pulled a chair beside her, the scrape of wood loud in the silence. He didn't speak, but his presence was an offering, a step toward the truth she'd uncovered. Claire's betrayal still loomed, a shadow Mark couldn't outrun. He'd call her tomorrow, demand answers, but the thought of her voice, defensive, tearful, made his chest ache. The locket was gone, sold to a pawnshop, its absence a wound in Mom's story. Claire's logic, her need to shield him from stress, didn't erase the secrecy. Family was supposed to share the load, not hide it. But Mark wondered what else they'd buried, what other truths lay beneath the surface. The house settled into night, its creaks and hums a familiar lullaby. Mark stood, crossing to the sink, the faucet's drip a steady pulse. He tightened it again, knowing it wouldn't hold, but the act felt like control, a small defiance against the chaos. Lily closed her laptop, the sound final, and slipped her phone into her pocket. She moved to the living room, checking Mom's blanket, her movements gentle but sure. Mark watched, struck by how naturally she carried the role he'd struggled to fill. The truths they'd uncovered, Brenda's theft, Claire's deception, weren't the end. They were a beginning, a crack in the routine that let light in. Mark felt the shift in himself, a sharpening of focus, a refusal to coast. He'd hire a new aide, vet them carefully, prioritize Mom's comfort over his inbox. But the house held more secrets, he was sure of it, and Lily's recordings were only the start. She'd shown him how to listen, not just to Mom but to the silences, the spaces where truth hid. He leaned against the counter, the coffee mug still there, its contents cold. The house was quiet, but not empty. Mom's presence, Lily's resolve, his own awakening. They filled the rooms, weaving a new rhythm. Mark didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, he wasn't running from it. He was ready to face the cracks, to hear the echoes, to carry the weight differently. The house woke slowly at dawn, its walls bathed in the soft gray of early light. Mark stood at the living room window, a mug of coffee warming his hands, its steam curling like a faint promise. Outside, the backyard lay still, weeds swaying in a breeze that carried the first hint of autumn. Inside, the air was softer, less burdened, though the weight of recent truths lingered like dust that refused to settle. Mom's recliner sat empty, her blanket folded neatly, a rare moment of calm before her day began. Mark's eyes traced the room, landing on the dresser where her jewelry box once held pride, now a quiet reminder of what was lost and what was found. Lily was gone, back to college 2 days ago, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she'd left for the bus station. The house felt larger without her, its corners sharper, but her presence hadn't vanished. Her recordings, now a podcast, lived on Mark's phone, pinned to his screen like a talisman. He'd listened last night, Mom's voice weaving through stories of her youth, a picnic by a river, a dance under strung lights, each fragment a thread tying him to her past. Lily had done more than preserve. She'd built a bridge, one Mark crossed each time he pressed play. The confrontation with Claire had unfolded yesterday, not in person but through a grainy video call, her face framed by a distant kitchen he didn't recognize. Mark had held the bank statement in his mind, its $4,000 withdrawal a silent accusation. He hadn't shouted, hadn't needed to. His questions were steady, deliberate, cutting deeper for their calm. Claire's eyes had darted away, her hands twisting a napkin into knots. She'd admitted to selling the locket, Mom's heirloom, gold with a filigree clasp, to cover medical bills insurance wouldn't touch. Her voice had cracked, torn between shame and defense, insisting she'd spared Mark the burden. The explanation hadn't healed the rift, it had only named it. Trust, once frayed, hung loose, and Mark wasn't sure how to weave it back. Brenda's absence was a different kind of wound, one Mark felt in the house's new rhythm. He'd hired a new aide, Sarah, a woman with kind eyes and a resume he'd checked twice. She moved through Mom's routine with care, her presence unobtrusive but steady, lacking the menthol edge that had marked Brenda's tenure. Mark watched her closely, not out of distrust but habit, a lesson learned from pearl studs found in a stolen moment. Brenda's betrayal, small thefts slipped into pockets, had been a crack in the system he'd built, exposing how easily he'd leaned on convenience. Sarah was a fresh start, but starts were fragile, and Mark carried the vigilance now, a weight he didn't resent. Mom was different since the truth surfaced. Her lucid moments came more often, or perhaps Mark was simply noticing them more. Yesterday, she'd reached for his hand, her grip weak but intentional, her eyes holding a warmth he'd thought was lost. She hadn't mentioned the ring, hadn't needed to. Her presence was enough, a quiet anchor in a house that had felt adrift. Mark spent evenings with her now, not just managing but reading her old letters, playing songs she used to hum. The tasks were the same, meds, meals, blankets, but the intent had shifted. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was tending. Lily's podcast was the unexpected gift, its episodes short but piercing. She'd stitched Mom's fragments into narratives, layering them with soft music, letting silences carry as much weight as words. Mark had listened to one about Mom's first job, her voice bright as she described the typewriter's clack and a boss who never smiled. It wasn't just memory, it was Mom, whole and vivid, reclaimed from the fog. The podcast wasn't public, shared only with family, but its existence felt like defiance, a refusal to let her fade. Lily had texted yesterday, mentioning plans for more episodes, maybe one with Claire. Mark hadn't responded, not yet. The idea stirred both hope and unease, a reminder of the rift still unbridged. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, its creaks less mournful. Mark had tackled the faucet last night, tightening it until the drip stopped, a small victory that felt larger than it was. The bills on the counter were sorted, not paid but organized, their chaos tamed for now. He'd cut work hours, delegating calls he'd once hoarded, a choice that left his inbox fuller but his mind clearer. The machine of his life, caregiving, work, family, still turned, but Mark moved differently within it, slower, more deliberate, his eyes open where they'd once been half-closed. Claire's silence was the shadow that remained. She'd promised to visit, to talk in person, but her words felt like placeholders, gestures toward a repair neither knew how to start. Mark didn't hate her. He understood her logic, her need to act alone. But understanding wasn't forgiveness, and the Locket's absence was a wound that ached in Mom's quiet moments. He wondered what else they'd hidden, what other choices had been made in the name of protection. The house held those secrets, tucked into its seams, and Mark felt their weight, even if he couldn't name them. He crossed to Mom's room now, her breathing steady, her face slack in sleep. The jewelry box sat on the dresser, empty but not discarded, a relic he couldn't bring himself to move. He touched its lid, the wood smooth under his fingers, and felt a pang, not for the gold, but for the stories it had held. Lily's podcast was filling that space, giving Mom a voice where objects had failed. Mark opened his phone, the app glowing, and played a clip, keeping the volume low. Mom's laugh, brief but bright, spilled into the room, a sound he hadn't heard in years. He stood there, letting it linger, letting it anchor him. The day stretched ahead, a canvas of routines and choices. Sarah would arrive soon, her bag free of menthol, her hands careful. Mom would wake, her eyes searching or serene, and Mark would be there, not just to manage but to listen. The bills would wait, the inbox would hum, but they were no longer the pulse of his life. Lily had shown him the cracks, not just in Brenda's lies or Claire's secrecy, but in himself. He'd been coasting, surviving, letting the machine carry him. Now, he was awake, and the waking was both burden and gift. He stepped outside, the coffee mug still in his hand, the air cool against his skin. The weeds in the backyard swayed, stubborn and alive, and Mark saw them differently, not neglect, but persistence. The house stood behind him, its windows catching the dawn, reflecting a man who wasn't whole, but was trying. He didn't know what broke next, Claire's distance, Mom's decline, his own limits, but he wasn't running anymore. The echoes were his to hear, and he was listening.